The head of Canada's spy agency is warning about the security threats Canada is facing in his first speech since taking the helm of the agency. CSIS Director Daniel Rogers pointed to violent extremism persisting as one of Canada's most significant national security concerns and raised what he called a concerning trend that nearly 1 in 10 terrorism investigations at CSIS involve a minor. Rogers also warned about the continued threat of foreign interference and espionage. Daniel Rogers is the director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. You know it better as CSIS, and he joins me now. Director Rogers, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
In your speech, you outlined a series of national security threats that Canada faces. I wanted to start with transnational repression. I know there's a lot of bad actors in that space, China, Russia, Iran, but India might be the highest profile one based on the events of the past couple of years. Is CSIS seeing any evidence that India is de-escalating its transnational repression efforts in Canada, or is it still at a high level?
Thanks for the question. And you're right, India has been talked about a lot by CSIS, by RCMP and others. What I would say is CSIS continues to be vigilant against India. I mean, it's something that we will continue to do to make sure that Canadians are safe. That said, it's clear that the government needs to have a good relationship with India, and they're emerging into a different phase of the relationship. So for CSIS, what that means is that we're going to help position the government to keep national security safe as it does that. So we'll engage with Indians, we'll do the national security work we have to do here, and if we see anything where we need to call that out publicly, we will, just as we have in the past.
But you know, as relations have started to normalize, the RCMP is still, warning people that their lives could be at risk, warning one sick activist to maybe assume a new identity and disappear. So, I mean, are these one-offs, or is it still at a high level? I just wonder what sort of the threat level would be that the intelligence service is seeing.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's important to realize that RCMP and law enforcement will do their work as they need to. Warning Canadians about threats to their safety or their lives is part of their work. We'll work with them if ever intelligence indicates that we need to pass something on for them to be able to do that. But the threats that RCMP would warn about can be criminal, they could be transnational, they could be from foreign states, so they're better placed to talk about that when they can.
So if we see the diplomatic efforts at the governmental level and the law enforcement efforts at the policing level, where does CSIS fit into that matrix in terms of dealing with transnational repression?
Yeah, I tried to outline a bit of this in the speech today. I mean, we have primarily, we're a security service, we're an intelligence service. We try and uncover any kind of transnational repression that might be happening covertly or secretly that could affect communities or individuals in Canada. Our role there is to provide intelligence. If there's threats to life or safety, we have mechanisms to pass that to the RCMP who can take appropriate action. Sometimes it means engaging with communities, community groups, and other stakeholders to help them be aware of and know how to report issues or how to be attentive to those things so that they can protect themselves.
One of the other issues you talked about is the threat of violent, ideologically motivated violent extremism in Canada. And the thing that jumped out to me as someone with a couple of young boys is that 1 in 10 of the terrorism suspects you come across are minors. Yeah. How new is that trend, and how worried are you about that particular trend?
Well, it is worrying. I mean, 1 in 10 may not sound like a big number, but when we're talking about kids, particularly who are being radicalized online, I think it's a concern to people like me who are parents and have children, but probably to anyone in society who sees that, particularly since young people, if left to radicalize, can cause the same harm as adults. The reason we're talking about it more now in Canada and with our Five Eyes partners is that we're trying to arm parents and guardians and others with the ability to intervene early to help prevent that. Because with kids, at least, there's sometimes different social structures that can help prevent radicalization and deal with it earlier. So if they see those warning signs of a child maybe become more aggressive or interacting online or, taking behaviors on that may be consistent with radicalization, they can be alert to those things.
So yeah, I mean, a diversion effort, obviously, to steer them away from it. But look, I even look at what my kids do in terms of the video games they play. They go deep into different things on tablets and that I do not know how they function, right? So what is it parents should watch for there? Because I know you're looking at it from a national security perspective, but is it just a change in behavior? Is there something else that you can look for in the digital space that can help identify someone at risk?
So it's a great question, and for any parent or guardian, I'd encourage them to kind of go to the websites where we put out more extensive information on this. I think having social supports around a young person is a great way to look for those indications. We can't just say that someone who spends a lot of time online is becoming radicalized. Most kids spend a lot of time online, and very few of them are radicalized. But if you see sort of ideological behaviors that are moving towards extreme, more aggression, more anger, recusing themselves and looking for purpose with a group of people that aren't in their social circles and may not be consistent with the values of the family, then those are things that parents can be attentive to and just start asking questions and looking into that a little more deeply. Not necessarily alarm bells that people are spending a lot of time online, but something to be attentive to.
How does CSIS counter that? I know you can't give a granular explanation of tactics and disruption methods, but broadly, what are the sort of things an intelligence service has to do there?
It's a spectrum. I mean, awareness, what we're doing right now, talking about it, making sure that Canadians understand the phenomenon and how they might intervene is one end of that spectrum. At the other end of that spectrum, it might be passing intelligence to law enforcement to help them to take law enforcement action, which unfortunately has to happen when things progress too far. It can also be about engaging community groups and providing information to just allow people to identify, the phenomenon before it gets too late. Sometimes a direct action might be talking to family about what we've seen as a mechanism of trying to help them engage with their kids to get off that path.
As they spend more and more time online, Canadians are exposed to more things, which is part of that problem, but they're also surrendering more things and their private information and their data. There's a conversation now about digital sovereignty and the concern that so much of our private information is held on servers in the United States or other countries outside of the Canadian jurisdiction. And this is a security risk to individuals because what measures you take to protect it here can't work in the US or in another country if the information's there. So how do you counter that increasingly? Does it just need to be something where we try to get our data on servers inside Canadian borders?
That's a great question. I think there's a whole policy conversation that should happen here. And that's not a CSIS conversation to start or end, but our information can help inform it. You're right that data that goes into different jurisdictions is subject to different rules. Some jurisdictions won't have the same kind of privacy protections and rules that Canadians would expect if the data was held here. So the first thing that we try and do is provide information so Canadians can make educated decisions about the types of platforms that they want to use and to make sure they understand the implications of that data and where that data is held. Our colleagues at the Communication Security Establishment do the same thing when it comes to cyber risks. Whether Canada wants to adopt a policy position or put new tools in place to keep data, in Canada is a question for the government. We'll happily provide advice and intelligence to inform.
How much of a risk is this, though? Because you mentioned specifically that some of the bad actors, in terms of espionage and looking for information, just buying it on the black market, they go hunting for this stuff. Yeah. And if it's outside of our control, we don't know how safe it is. So how do you deal with that?
Well, so the risks are there, and I think you're right to point that out. When we talk, it's not disassociated from the other risks that we talked about. Transnational repression can be enabled if a country has the data about the dissidents that it seeks to repress or others. You can imagine influence and online disinformation campaigns fueled by data analysis that happens based on Canadians' data. So there are a number of theoretical concerns that we would deal with. Part of it is calling it out when we see it, which is something we did during the election as we provided weekly updates on what we see. That includes disinformation and other types of information. As to the data concern, for us, it's about intelligence collection, informing the government, and allowing them to make the right decisions.
Right. You mentioned the election and the issue of foreign interference. The conclusions have been there have been attempts, but it was not material, broadly, in terms of affecting the overall outcome. In a national election, when you have sort of regional differences, multi-parties, it's a difficult system to hack, especially with paper ballots. But a referendum, a binary choice, is a different sort of thing, as we saw with Brexit and in sort of the US-style elections. There's a real possibility we'll have something in Alberta next year, maybe in Quebec within the next 2 years. Is CSIS prepared for the possibility of an attempt to have interference in sovereignty referendums in this country in the next couple of years?
Well, I think I'd have to start by saying Canadians exercising their opinion is not something that CSIS would have a role in. Our act specifically prohibits us from looking at
the manipulation of the information ecosystem in that moment could be a real vulnerability.
So absolutely. Our core job is looking at threats to the security of Canada, which includes foreign interference, which might include attempts by foreign states to interfere. We have to position ourselves to be able to identify those intentions and actions by foreign states, and that's what we do as part of the Security Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force. That's prominent during the elections, like the general election we just had, but that exists throughout all times, even when we're not there with elections. So we'll work with CSE, with the Global Affairs Rapid Response Mechanism and RCMP to detect that when we can.
But is a binary choice, a yes-no, like of a referendum, is that by its nature more vulnerable than 5 or 6 parties seeking office in 343 different ridings. You know what I mean? Like Brexit, we saw real attempts to use data and social media to sway public opinion. We haven't had that kind of a yes-no in Canada in a long, long time, the 1990s. Do you see an extra vulnerability there, I wonder?
I don't know that I can quantify the vulnerability. I would say that we definitely have to be attentive to the possibility of information operations or interference. You know, I think that anything where a foreign adversary might seek to divide Canadians, to amplify narratives that don't truly reflect the views of the Canadians that are expressing their opinions would be of concern. I think that can happen in a binary choice or in a general election. For us, it's not necessarily just about the potential impact, it's about identifying it and calling out and preventing it.
Okay, I have one last question I hope to squeeze in. You mentioned the Arctic. There's a massive focus on economic development there, sovereignty, more of a military presence. You said you're positioning yourselves at CSIS to partner and defend Canada's interests whenever it's necessary in the Arctic. Russia has built out military and civilian infrastructure in its Arctic well ahead of where Canada is over the past number of decades. How prepared is Canada for this whole new frontier in the Arctic?
Well, for CSIS's part, we're becoming prepared, and I think we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years specifically to do that. That's why we've built those partnerships with Indigenous groups, with governments, and with the private sector in the region. We're also working with the government to make sure that any potential economic investment or infrastructure projects benefit from our intelligence and our security advice. So I would say at CSIS, we're well prepared to do that, but we're going to have to keep monitoring the priorities to adjust where we need to.
CSIS Director Daniel Rogers, appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in, sir.
Thanks very much.